Hello and welcome back to the Broken Past. I apologize that it's been quite a while since the last video released. I had some issues with a few orders that I made that were broken when I got them in the mail. I also had a nasty cold and I lost my voice for over a week, so I couldn't go back and narrate this video. But now we're back and we're ready to go. As you can tell, this time we're branching out a little bit. Today we're not fixing a gaming console. This time, however, we're fixing a broken iPhone 7 Plus. The screen itself on this phone still functions, but the glass is completely shattered, so we'll be replacing the entire front assembly. I also have a special guest helping me fix it this time around, so you'll see both of us alternate as we go about trying to fix the phone. With that, sit back and enjoy. Hopefully this will help out for any of you who have accidentally destroyed your screen as well and want to go through the process of repairing and replacing it yourself. The first step in fixing the phone is to remove the SIM card out of the phone. Hopefully your kit comes with the SIM removal tool, but if not, you can just simply use a small paper clip and push it in the hole and the SIM card will just pop right out. The next step is to remove the two pentalobe screws on the bottom of the phone. These are pretty tiny screws, but as long as you've got the right bit, they're not too hard to get out of there. The next step is to begin the process of removing the front of the screen from the rest of the phone. This is held in place by a watertight gasket that has a pretty strong adhesive to it. The easiest way to remove this is to take a heating pad or something and begin softening up the glue by simply just positioning it on the bottom of the phone and just letting it sit for 30 to 45 seconds and let it start just loosening up the adhesive. From here you can take a suction cup and position it on the front of the screen just above the home button. You can then use your palm and providing a little bit of leverage to the suction cup. You can pull on it and begin attempting to separate it from the rest of the phone. By taking a spudger or a pick while the front of the screen is still warm, simply work your way around the bottom and the sides of the phone, slowly loosening up the adhesive all the way around. Be careful when you get to the top of the phone because that's got some additional ribbon cables, so we'll need to be careful with it, but just simply work your way around the phone, carefully loosening it. You'll feel it as it starts to disconnect the clips and loosen up the adhesive gasket as well. In our case, we had to reheat the heating pad by the time we got to the top of the screen. The whole phone had cooled off enough at that point that it was just easiest to reheat it and soften it up so we could continue working on the top of the screen. Once you've fully disconnected the front of the screen from the rest of the phone, simply open it up to the right. There's a bunch of ribbon cables on the right side, so by opening it up from the left to the right, we'll make sure that we don't put any stress on the rest of the cables. The next step is to remove the small metal plate, which covers both the battery connector as well as the connectors for the screen and I believe the home button as well. Make sure in this case you use the right bit for the right screws, as well as making sure that you keep track of which screw goes into which hole. The screws may look the same, but there are some differences, and we want to make sure that we don't put the wrong screws back into the wrong holes. In our case, our kit came with a really small magnetic screw mat. You can see in the top left of the screen that was really helpful in our case to make sure that we could keep the screws properly organized, so we made sure when we put it back together that they went into the right spots. Once all the screws are removed, you can simply take a small set of tweezers and the metal plate will just pop right off, revealing the connectors underneath of it. The first connector that we want to disconnect is the battery connector itself. This helps make sure that we don't accidentally short anything out and risk damage to the battery or any other components in the phone. The next connectors to remove are the two that are right next to the battery connector. These are for the screen and I believe the home button as well. These are positioned one on top of the other. So once you remove the top one, you'll see the next connector underneath of that. Simply lift them up carefully with the spudger and just slightly pull them off to the side. From here we have another metal plate on the top of the phone that we need to remove. This one contains 3 screws and it covers another connector for the front screen. Simply, just like the other one, we'll remove the 3 screws and the cover plate will just come right off. We now have another connector to remove. This one's a little bit wider than the other ones. We just want to make sure when we remove it that we don't pull on it at an odd angle and potentially rip the connector, but it's just simply slide a spudger underneath of it and it'll pop out. At this point, we can remove the rest of the phone and set it off to the side and focus all of our attention on the front of the phone. We have a few more things we'll need to remove before we're fully done with this old broken piece of the phone. The next thing we're going to look at is this small metal bracket on the bottom of the phone. This thing contains 3 screws, 2 of which attach it to the frame and 1 of which attaches it to the back side of the home button. We simply need to remove these 3 screws and then we can take the metal plate off. In our case, however, the screw that attached to the home button ended up being, I don't know, it was overly tightened or the screw was just already pre-stripped or something, but we had the heck of a time getting it out. We ended up buying new bits. We probably spent a good hour or two just on this one screw. Eventually, we just lucked out and managed to get a bite with a flathead screwdriver, but just be really careful when you're working with these screws that you use the right bit and you put constant pressure on it, and you're just really careful when you're done, because this screw probably was one of the most difficult things that we had to do with this whole phone. Once we finally have the screws out and the bracket removed, we've got one small connector for the home button that we need to remove. Simply flip up the connector protector, and underneath of that will be a small connector that we can disengage from the back of the phone. At this point, it might be beneficial to rewarm our heating pad and position it over the ribbon cable for the home button. It's attached with some adhesive, and simply warming it up will help to soften that so we can remove that ribbon cable a little bit easier. Being very careful, we can take the pointy end of a spudger and position it between the ribbon cable and the frame itself, and very carefully use it to pry and lift up on the ribbon cable, and it should come free with just a little bit of force. At this point, the home button will just fall out through the front of the phone, and we can set it off to the side for later. We now have a number of screws on the top of the phone that we need to remove. Removing these will allow us to then remove this bracket that holds both the earpiece as well as a number of components into place. After removing the bracket, we can use a spudger to carefully remove the camera from the back of the phone. The camera is attached to a ribbon cable, which is also used to help hold the speaker into place. So by simply using a spudger, we can gently lift it up and out of its socket and out of the way. After removing the camera and ribbon cable out of the way, we can then use our fingers or a pair of tweezers to remove the speaker assembly out of there as well. The biggest thing here is just to make sure that you don't touch the tiny springs underneath of the speaker, otherwise it could affect the contacts between it and the pins underneath of it. From here, there's a pretty detailed ribbon assembly that's used to attach both the camera, the pins, an IR sensor, all sorts of stuff. It's probably best to not try to detail that in this video. I would definitely recommend, once you get to this point, to grab an iFixit guide and look over it, because most of this is attached with adhesive, and the biggest thing is just making sure that you don't accidentally rip the ribbon cable as you unfold the entire thing out of the assembly. So just be careful here, follow the iFixit guide, and this will come out not too bad. Once we've removed the ribbon cable and accessories from the top, we're almost done. At this point, the last thing we have to do is remove this shield off the back of the screen, which we will transplant to the new screen as well. This step's not too bad. There's a few screws on both sides. We did have an issue with one of these screws sticking as well. And after fighting with the screw from the home button a while back, we ultimately just ended up cutting part of the metal shield off because we didn't want to fight with it. Your mileage may vary on if you run into issues with this, but again, just make sure you provide enough pressure behind the screw, and they shouldn't come out with too much effort. Once the screws are all out, the shield will just slide up and out, leaving behind the rest of the screen that we no longer need at this point. At this point, we put a microfiber cloth down to protect the new screen from getting scratched up during reassembly process. Our old screen left a lot of pieces of glass all over our working surface, and we wanted to make sure that that didn't scratch up the new screen as we worked on it. So just simply positioned that down, and we were good to go. We then took our shield that we removed from the previous step and positioned it over our new screen, making sure to slide the ribbon cable properly through the slot in the shield. and everything just kind of fell into place. By partially attaching the shield to the back of the screen using the screws on the bottom of the phone, it helped us to make sure that everything was aligned properly, so that way when we got to the rest of the screws and the ribbon cable, that everything fit nice and snug. Before attaching the rest of the screws, we made sure that the ribbon cable was lined up properly. There's a small gasket, I guess, that goes around the ribbon cable, that once that's in place, it helps to ensure that everything is lined up properly. So the next step was to make sure that that was seated correctly. In our case, we ended up leaving the blue adhesive strip, I guess, on the back of the phone. It kind of helped also just ensure that everything was lined up properly. And it was small enough that we didn't really feel like it was going to impact the overall reassembly process any. From here, we simply reattach the rest of the shield to the back of the phone using the screws on the side of the case. The next step was to reinstall the home button through the slit on the bottom. We want to make sure that we attach the home button from the front, and then from the back side, there's a few guide pins that will align the ribbon cable with the rest of the frame. In our case, the home button didn't sit as flush as it did on the old screen, but there's nothing we could really do. I don't know if it's just a manufacturing defect or what, but in the end it worked, but it was a little bit concerning at first when we put it back together. After reinserting the home button, we simply reconnect the ribbon cable with the one connector on the side, and then put the cover back over it, and we're good to go. We can then take our metal bracket and reattach it to both the frame as well as the home button, and everything should secure back up in place nicely. At this point, the next step is to take the complicated ribbon cable and accessories on the top of the phone and put that back into place. Just as before, I'd recommend viewing the iFixit guide to get a better idea of exactly how to fold this thing so it fits into place. It really wasn't too bad overall, but it definitely was good to reference the guide to make sure that we had it back in the way it should be. After reattaching the ribbon cable, the next step is to set the speaker into place, making sure that the springs properly connect to the pins on the ribbon cable itself. At this point, we can take the camera and ribbon cable assembly and slide it back over the speaker and attach it back into its spot. We can then take the metal bracket and the supplied screws and secure everything back into place. At this point, we're ready to reattach the new screen to the rest of the phone. Again, I'd recommend taking a look at the iFixit guide for the top ribbon cable. It has a pretty good series of bends in it to get it to properly line up. And it's kind of hard to explain in a video, but by looking at the pictures, you should be able to see how it twists and turns to make sure that it can properly connect to its connector on the phone. So just take a look at that and verify that it's twisted properly, and it should seat into place nicely. Once the ribbon cable is in place, we can cover it with our metal bracket, and using the screws, we can secure it all back into place. It may help to prop up the front screen of the phone to help with the installation of the ribbon cables and the rest of the phone. It is a little bit tight if it's fully flat, so by propping it up a little bit, it helps to alleviate some of that tension on the cables. At this point, we have the two lower ribbon cables to reconnect. Simply start with the lower one, install it, and then the upper one should fall into place right over top of the other one. As long as we properly installed the sticker that surrounds the ribbon cable on the front of the screen, everything should line up nicely for us. After everything else is connected, all that we have left is to reconnect the battery in its socket. We then have our last metal bracket to install over those connectors and the screws for the metal bracket, and we are done with the inside of the phone. At this point, before closing it all up, it's probably best to test the screen and make sure that what we've done so far has been good. So simply making sure that we have power, we can turn it on, and success! We can see that this new screen looks and works great. Even though it was a super cheap aftermarket screen, when comparing it to an OEM factory screen, we really couldn't tell a difference. It looked really good overall. We did have one issue with the screen though that you can see here. It looks like there was a piece of dirt or debris or something that got between the backlight and the reflector that ultimately put a small crease in it. But at this point, the phone's old enough and we spent enough time on it and the screen was cheap enough that we really didn't worry about it. We couldn't see it when there was detail on the phone, but something to keep in mind as you do this as well. And now it's time to button it all up. This part's really not too bad. The biggest thing to keep in mind is to first slide the screen upward into the back of the phone which helps to make sure it aligns correctly. Then you can simply work down the sides, making sure the clips latch all the way down towards the bottom. All we have left is a few pentalobe screws on the bottom of the phone to install, and we're done. The overall process to replace the screen really wasn't too bad. Like I said before, a few of the issues we had were some strip screws that weren't getting removed properly. The biggest thing with that is just making sure you take it slow, make sure you've got the right bit for the job. We ended up using the cheap bits that came with the set. Definitely would recommend buying higher quality bits to help to prevent those from stripping and from jumping and running into those issues. But yeah, overall, I mean, the screen was $35 and it allowed us to keep this phone from making its way into a landfill. So overall, great project. It was a lot of fun to do, and I'm glad that we were able to fix this phone for our guest. So with that, thanks so much for watching. I am following this video up with some outtakes of our process. So if you're interested, stick around and watch those. So once again, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
So you said you've done this before, right? You said?
Not with this phone.
Do you want me to bring
Oh no.
like an iPad?
Oh. Come on. What's wrong with this thing? There we go. Oh god, did it explode?
I don't think so.
Maybe you just have a really good microwave. I'll try my little tiny one here. Oh no. Oh no. Now they're gonna be like, there's two different hands.
Two hands. I just like tanning the left side of my body.
One of these things is not like the other. Is that a try point?
I don't know.
I'm not the most nimble.
Me neither.
We're only on the first couple screws and we've already hit a snag.
Everything's built for right-handed people. Yeah, you hear the grinding on the table?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All that glass.
Yeah, I hope you have something to clean that down. How do you get those out? I'm afraid. Are you really steady-handed with super glue?
Not really.
There can't be that much torque on this thing.
No.
That like...
Especially when the instructions say don't over tighten.
That's a good sign.
Yeah. Just don't let it tip over and already snap itself off.
Yeah. I think there's a better chance of it not doing that by me not touching it.
True.
Maybe.
Oh, there goes.
No! Just be like, so, we worked on this for a long time, ordered different parts, screws, everything. Like, you have to celebrate with some bourbon.
After getting that one screw out.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Jesus. I would like to know what the difficulty of getting this up should be, you know?
Right. Yeah. Boom.
Oh, the hell. Look at me. I fix stuff all the time.
That's why I get the big bucks. The pennies.
I'm fixing it. These are all the same size, you said?
No, they're different. They're underneath.
Is that gentle?
Sure.
Feel more comfortable.
Why do I have to do all the scary parts?
Because you mess with scary things all the time.
Oh my god. Like that?
Hopefully.
Got it.
Hopefully it's not stuck in there. We'll figure it out. Go get a glass and have some bourbon.
Never gonna be an iPhone repairman. Thank you. Hey, Lefty Lucy.
I was just worried. I was like, maybe it's upside down or something weird? I don't know. Why can't you just do that?
Because I turned it to the right. One.
Yeah, I think it's grindy time.
Grindy time. Is that from one of the pieces of glass?
Okay.
So now do you do everything in reverse?
I think so. I'm scared to rip that off. Oh god, it attached itself to the... I wonder how hard it is to cross thread these. What What will your title be for this video?
Oh my god, why did I do this?
I may have been off more than I can chew. When a friend asks you to do something for them.
I don't want to see that thing.
I don't either. I don't want to put it back on.
Don't make me do stuff.
I really hope I put those in the right order. I thought I was going to have to get another display there for a second. I thought I got the cable.
Can you push maybe with this?
Maybe,
the bottom?
yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good
just-
point. Or, yeah, let me try with the plastic spudger.
Oh, there you go. That's probably a better idea. Oh god.
Oh. Oh, no. Oh. Oh, that's... So don't do that.